Princess Zarathel stood before the massive crystalline windows of her throne room, watching the twin suns of Zerion Prime cast dancing shadows across the polished marble floor. Her four arms moved in nervous patterns, a habit her species developed when anxious. The delicate silver scales along her neck shimmered as she turned toward the ornate throne where her father, Emperor Kethmor, sat waiting. "The humans arrive within the hour," the Emperor announced, his deep voice echoing through the vast chamber. "Remember, daughter, this alliance could save our empire from the Void Reapers. These creatures have already consumed 17 star systems. We cannot face them alone." Zarathel nodded, though doubt gnawed at her mind. Humans were a young race, barely 3,000 years into space travel. What could they possibly offer against an enemy that had terrorized the galaxy for millennia? The Zerion Empire had stood for over 50,000 years, commanding respect from hundreds of species. Yet here they were, desperate enough to seek help from newcomers. "I have heard strange stories about them," she said, her voice carrying the musical quality typical of her people. "They say humans fight differently than any species we have encountered." "Indeed," Emperor Kethmor replied, his 6 eyes focusing on a holographic display showing recent battle footage. "Watch this." The hologram flickered to life, showing a space battle above a burning world. Zarathel gasped as she watched human ships charge directly into Void Reaper formations, ignoring tactical doctrine that every civilized species followed. Instead of maintaining safe distances and trading long-range fire, the human vessels closed to point-blank range, their crews apparently unconcerned about their own survival. "They call it ramming speed," her father explained. "When a human ship is critically damaged, instead of retreating, they accelerate toward the largest enemy vessel they can target. The destruction is remarkable." Zarathel studied the footage with growing amazement. She watched human fighters break formation to shield damaged Allied ships, saw crews manually detonate their own engines to create barriers of debris, witnessed acts of sacrifice that defied logic. No species fought like this. The galaxy's military academies taught preservation of assets, strategic withdrawal, acceptable loss ratios. Humans seem to have missed those lessons entirely. A chime echoed through the throne room, indicating the human delegation had arrived at the palace. Zarathel felt her hearts beating faster. Her species had 3 hearts, and all 3 were racing with anticipation. She had studied human physiology in preparation for this meeting. They were remarkably similar to her own people, though they possessed only 2 arms, and their skin was covered in a strange, soft material rather than protective scales. The massive doors at the far end of the throne room began to open, each leaf weighing several tons and requiring anti-grav assistance to move. Zarathel positioned herself beside her father's throne, assuming the formal stance expected of Zerion royalty. Her elegant dress, woven from star silk and embedded with microcrystals that caught the light, rustled softly as she moved. A herald stepped forward, his voice amplified by the chamber's acoustics. "Presenting Ambassador Elena Vasquez of the Terran Federation, General Marcus Chen of the Terran Defense Force, and Captain James Mitchell of the Terran Marine Corps." Zarathel expected to see beings matching the diplomatic protocols she had studied. Ambassadors were typically elderly, wise-looking individuals chosen for their patience and political skill. Military leaders were usually professionals who kept their emotions carefully controlled, presenting themselves with measured dignity. Captain James Mitchell was nothing like what she expected. He strode into the throne room with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, yet somehow avoided being offensive. His uniform was practical rather than ceremonial, dark fabric with minimal decoration, designed for function over appearance. Unlike the other humans who walked with measured diplomatic steps, Mitchell moved like a predator surveying new territory. Zarathel found herself staring. Humans were supposed to be physically unimpressive compared to most galactic species. They lacked the natural armor of the Krextai, the multiple limbs of her own people, the enhanced senses of the Velthari. Yet watching this human approach, she felt something she had never experienced before. Mitchell stood nearly 2 meters tall, broad-shouldered and lean. His dark hair was cut short in military fashion, and his eyes, those strange, single-colored human eyes, swept the throne room with obvious tactical assessment. He was cataloging exits, sight lines, potential defensive positions. Even in a diplomatic setting, he remained a warrior. When the human delegation reached the appropriate distance from the throne, Ambassador Vasquez and General Chen performed formal bows according to Zarion protocol. Captain Mitchell, however, simply nodded once, a gesture that should have been insulting but somehow conveyed more respect than elaborate ceremony. "Your Imperial Majesty," Ambassador Vasquez began, "we are honored by your invitation to discuss mutual defense against the Void Reaper threat." Emperor Kethamor responded with traditional diplomatic courtesy, but Zarathel barely heard the words. She was watching Mitchell, noting how his attention never completely focused on the conversation. His eyes moved constantly, not from nervousness, but from ingrained tactical awareness. This was a being who had survived by staying alert, who treated every environment as potentially hostile. "Captain Mitchell," the Emperor said, drawing Zarathel's attention back to the discussion, "we have reviewed reports of human military actions against the Void Reapers. Your tactics are unconventional." For the first time since entering the throne room, Mitchell spoke. His voice was deeper than she expected, carrying an accent she couldn't identify. "Conventional tactics don't work against an enemy that feeds on fear and despair, Your Majesty. The Reapers expect rational behavior from their opponents. We prefer to be unpredictable." "Unpredictable," Zarathel found herself saying, though she hadn't intended to speak. "Is that why your species charges into battle when others would retreat?" Mitchell's gaze shifted to her, and she felt her scales flush with embarrassment at having spoken out of turn. But instead of the diplomatic non-answer she expected, he smiled, an expression that transformed his entire face. "Your Highness," he said, and somehow made the formal address sound personal rather than ceremonial. "Humans have a saying, 'The best defense is a good offense.' We've found that when someone's trying to kill you, the most effective response is to kill them first, faster, and with more enthusiasm than they expect." The casual way he spoke of violence should have been shocking. Civilized species discussed military action in euphemisms, treating warfare as an unfortunate necessity, requiring regretful decisions. Mitchell talked about killing the way others might discuss the weather. "And if the odds are against you?" Zarathel asked, genuinely curious despite the breach of protocol. Mitchell's smile widened. "Then we make our own odds. Humans don't believe in no-win scenarios, Your Highness. There's always a way to turn the tables if you're willing to pay the price." Ambassador Vasquez cleared her throat diplomatically. "What the captain means is that human tactical doctrine emphasizes adaptability and aggressive response to threats." But Zarathel was no longer listening to diplomatic language. She was studying Mitchell's face, noting the small scars that marked someone who had seen real combat, the way he held himself with unconscious readiness. This was not a parade ground soldier or palace guard. This was a warrior who had faced death and emerged victorious. The formal presentations continued, with holographic displays showing human military capabilities, star charts marking Void Reaper incursions, and strategic analyses of potential alliance benefits. Zarathel participated appropriately, asking relevant questions and making appropriate comments. But her attention kept returning to the human captain who stood silently beside his companions. During a pause in the presentations, Emperor Kethamor rose from his throne. We will consider your proposals carefully. Princess Zarathel will coordinate with your delegation to address any questions or concerns. Zarathel felt a moment of panic. She had never been assigned to handle diplomatic relations before. Her father was clearly testing her, but the prospect of spending time with these humans, particularly with Mitchell, created a flutter of anticipation she didn't fully understand. "Of course, father," she replied, maintaining royal composure despite her racing hearts. As the formal meeting concluded and the humans prepared to leave, Mitchell approached her directly. The casual confidence with which he addressed royalty should have been presumptuous, but instead felt refreshingly honest. "Your Highness," he said, "if I may suggest, any discussion of joint military operations would benefit from seeing human forces in action. Would you be interested in observing a training exercise?" The question was obviously inappropriate. A princess did not visit military installations, particularly those of foreign powers. Diplomatic protocol required careful negotiation through proper channels. "Yes," she heard herself saying, "I would find that very educational." Mitchell's grin was answer enough. As the human delegation departed, Zarathel remained in the throne room, staring at the doors through which they had exited. Something fundamental had changed in the space of an hour. She had entered the meeting as a dutiful princess performing diplomatic obligations. She was leaving it as a woman who had encountered something entirely outside her experience. "Daughter," Emperor Kethmore said quietly, "be careful. Humans are not like other species we have dealt with. They are intense." Zarathel nodded absently, but her mind was already planning tomorrow's visit to the human training facility. She had a feeling that intensity was exactly what to the human training facility orbited Zerion Prime's third moon, a collection of interconnected modules that looked more like a mining station than a military base. Zarathel's diplomatic transport approached the docking bay, and she found herself pressing against the viewing port like a child visiting a new world. "Your Highness," her aide Veltar whispered nervously, "perhaps we should reconsider this visit. It's highly irregular for Zerion royalty to—" "I'm conducting diplomatic reconnaissance," Zarathel interrupted, though she knew her four-armed advisor was right to be concerned. She had barely slept since yesterday's meeting, her mind replaying every word Mitchell had spoken, every gesture he had made. The logical part of her brain insisted this was mere curiosity about human military capabilities. The rest of her knew better. Captain Mitchell was waiting in the docking bay when her transport connected. Unlike yesterday's formal uniform, he wore practical combat gear, dark fabric with obvious armor plating, numerous pouches and attachments whose purposes she could only guess. He looked dangerous and competent in a way that made her hearts race. "Your Highness," he said, offering what humans called a salute, a simple gesture that somehow conveyed more respect than elaborate Zerion bowing rituals. "Welcome aboard the Crucible." "Thank you for accommodating this visit, Captain," she replied, trying to match his direct manner. "I confess I'm very curious about human training methods." Mitchell's grin appeared again, that expression that seemed to light up his entire face. "I think you'll find them interesting. Fair warning, though. We don't typically pull punches just because we have observers. What you'll see today is how we actually prepare for combat." As they walked through the facility's corridors, Zarathel noted the differences from Zerion military installations. Everything was functional rather than ceremonial, built for efficiency rather than display. The walls were lined with equipment she didn't recognize, weapons that looked improvised rather than manufactured, modifications that suggested human engineers approached problems differently than her people. "Your equipment seems very practical," she observed diplomatically. "Human military philosophy is simple," Mitchell explained as they passed a group of soldiers performing maintenance on their gear. "If it works, use it. If it doesn't work, fix it. If you can't fix it, turn it into something that explodes and throw it at the enemy." Zarathel laughed, despite herself. Every military doctrine she had studied emphasized careful preservation of resources, detailed logistics planning, risk management. Humans apparently approached warfare like enthusiastic amateurs who had stumbled into competence through pure determination. They entered an observation deck overlooking a massive training chamber. Below them, two teams of human soldiers were engaged in what Mitchell called a live fire exercise. Zarathel watched in fascination as the humans moved through a complex obstacle course, while shooting at each other with what appeared to be actual weapons. "Are those real bullets?" she asked, alarmed. "Training rounds," Mitchell assured her. "They'll leave bruises and hurt like hell, but they won't cause permanent damage. We've found that soldiers train harder when there are actual consequences for mistakes." Zarathel observed the exercise with growing amazement. The humans moved with fluid aggression, using cover creatively, supporting each other with tactics that seemed chaotic but were clearly coordinated. When one soldier was killed by training fire, his teammates didn't merely adjust their formation, they became visibly angry, fighting harder to avenge their fallen comrade. "Your people become emotional during combat," she noted. "Emotion is a weapon," Mitchell replied seriously. "Every other species tries to suppress fear, anger, grief during battle. Humans have learned to use those feelings as fuel. A human who's angry fights harder than a human who's calm. A human who's protecting something precious becomes nearly unstoppable." As if to demonstrate his point, one of the soldiers below took a training round to the shoulder, but continued advancing on the enemy position. His face contorted with determined fury. His teammates rallied around him, their coordinated assault becoming more aggressive rather than more cautious. "It seems inefficient," Zarathel said, though she was clearly fascinated. "Zerion military doctrine teaches emotional control as a primary virtue." "Maybe that's why you're losing to the Void Reapers," Mitchell said quietly. The words should have been insulting. Instead, they hit Zarathel like a physical blow because they contained an uncomfortable truth. The Zerion Empire's military had always prided itself on rational, measured responses to threats. Their commanders made decisions based on careful analysis of acceptable losses and strategic objectives. They had never faced an enemy that fed on fear and despair, that grew stronger from their victims' terror. "The Reapers use fear as a weapon," she said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn. "They expect their enemies to become more cautious when afraid." "Exactly," Mitchell nodded approvingly. "But humans get angry when we're afraid. We don't retreat from scary things. We charge at them screaming and shooting until they're not scary anymore. The Reapers don't know how to handle that." Before Zarathel could respond, alarms began wailing throughout the facility. Emergency lights bathed the corridors in red, and Mitchell's casual demeanor instantly transformed into focused intensity. He touched a communication device at his collar. "Mitchell here. What's the situation?" A voice crackled through the device, tense with urgency. "Captain, we've got Void Reaper scouts in the outer system. 3 ships, moving toward the planet. Zerion Defense Fleet is mobilizing, but they're requesting human support." Mitchell's expression hardened. "How long until they reach the planet?" 6 hours, sir. Maybe less if they accelerate." Zarathel felt ice forming in her veins. Void Reaper scouts meant a full invasion force would follow. Her people had faced scout incursions before. They always preceded massive attacks that left entire worlds as lifeless husks. "Your Highness," Mitchell said, his voice carrying a new edge, "I need to get you back to the planet immediately. My ship can—" "No!" Zarathel interrupted, surprising herself with the firmness of her voice. "I want to see how humans fight when it matters." Mitchell stared at her for a long moment. "This isn't a training exercise. People are going to die today." "That's exactly why I need to see this," she replied. "If we're going to be allies, I need to understand what human courage looks like in real battle." For the first time since she had met him, Mitchell looked uncertain. "Your Highness, I can't guarantee your safety. Human combat doctrine doesn't include protecting observers." "Then don't treat me as an observer," Zarathel said, making a decision that would have horrified her father. "Your people don't believe in no-win scenarios, correct? Then teach me to fight like a human." Mitchell's grin returned, fiercer than before. "You might regret that request, Your Highness." 20 minutes later, Zarathel found herself strapped into the gunner's seat of a human fighter craft, wearing armor that had been hastily modified to accommodate her 4 arms. The pilot, a woman named Sarah Chen, was explaining the weapon systems with the same casual attitude humans seem to apply to everything involving violence. "The main guns fire depleted uranium rounds at 30,000 rounds per minute, Chen explained as their fighter launched from the training facility. "The missiles are nuclear-tipped, and the particle beam can cut through most armor like tissue paper. Try not to shoot any of our own people." Through the fighter's viewports, Zarathel could see the human fleet assembling, dozens of ships ranging from massive dreadnoughts to single-pilot fighters like theirs. The Xerion defense fleet was also mobilizing, their elegant vessels forming classical battle formations that had been refined over millennia. "The humans are already moving to engage," Chen continued, her voice carrying excitement rather than fear. "Standard human doctrine. Hit them fast, hit them hard, and don't give them time to think." Zarathel watched the tactical display as the 2 fleets approached the Void Reaper scouts. The Xerion ships maintained careful spacing, advancing at optimal speed for weapon effectiveness. The human vessels were accelerating to maximum velocity, apparently intending to close to point-blank range as quickly as possible. "Your formations are completely chaotic," she observed. "That's the point," Chen laughed. "Predictable formations make easy targets. We prefer creative chaos over tactical perfection." The first contact between human ships and Void Reapers was unlike any battle Zarathel had studied. Instead of the careful, long-range engagement she expected, the humans charged directly into the enemy formation, their ships weaving between Reaper vessels while firing continuously. Through her fighter's communication system, she could hear human voices coordinating the attack. "This is Hammer 1. I've got a Reaper cruiser painted, going for ramming speed." "Negative, Hammer 1. Pull back and let us soften it up first." "Too late. I'm already committed. Tell my wife I love her." Zarathel watched in horror and fascination as the human ship accelerated directly toward a Void Reaper vessel 10 times its size. At the last moment, the pilot ejected his engine core, turning his fighter into a guided missile that tore through the enemy's hull. The explosion was visible even from their distant position. "Did he just sacrifice himself to destroy one enemy ship?" she asked, shocked. "That's why we call it ramming speed," Chen replied grimly. "Sometimes it's the only way to guarantee a kill." But instead of being demoralized by their comrade's sacrifice, the other human pilots became more aggressive. Their attacks intensified, their coordination improved, and their voices over the communication channels carried a note of righteous fury that made Zarathel's skin crawl with excitement. "They're getting stronger," she realized. "Your people become more effective when you take casualties." "Pain makes us angry," Chen confirmed. "And angry humans are dangerous humans. The Reapers feed on fear and despair, but they can't digest pure rage." As if to prove her point, the human fleet was systematically destroying the Void Reaper scouts despite being outnumbered and outgunned. Their tactics made no logical sense, ships breaking formation to shield damaged allies, pilots ejecting at the last moment only to be picked up by other vessels, coordinated strikes that required split-second timing and absolute trust in fellow pilots. "Your turn, Your Highness," Chen announced as they approached a damaged Reaper vessel. "Let's see if you can fight like a human." Zarathel's 4 hands found the weapon controls, her training in diplomatic protocol suddenly seeming irrelevant compared to the targeting computer in front of her. The Void Reaper ship was wounded, trailing dark energy that made her scales crawl with instinctive fear. "I can't do this," she whispered, her courage faltering as they approached the alien vessel. "Yes, you can," Chen said firmly. "Don't think like a princess. Don't think like a Zarion. Think like someone whose home is being threatened by monsters." The Reaper ship turned toward them, weapons charging with malevolent energy. Zarathel felt the familiar terror that all civilized beings experienced when facing the galaxy's most feared predators. But underneath the fear, something else was growing. Something hot and angry and utterly human. "They want to destroy my world," she said quietly. "They want to kill everyone you care about," Chen agreed. "They think they can make us afraid. Show them how wrong they are." Zarathel's hands moved across the weapons controls, and the fighters' guns opened fire. Depleted uranium rounds tore into the Reaper vessel's hull, followed by missiles that exploded in chains of nuclear fire. She wasn't thinking about diplomatic consequences or strategic objectives. She was thinking about her father's palace burning, her people screaming in terror, her homeworld reduced to lifeless rock. The Void Reaper ship exploded in a burst of dark energy, and Zarathel felt something she had never experienced before: the savage satisfaction of defeating an enemy through pure violence. "Not bad for a beginner," Chen said with approval. "You might make a decent human after all." As they returned to the fleet, Zarathel realized that something fundamental had changed within her. She had always been taught that violence was regrettable but sometimes necessary, that combat was a tool to be used carefully and with reluctance. But watching the humans fight, participating in their aggressive tactics, she had discovered something her people had forgotten. Sometimes violence wasn't just necessary. Sometimes it was joyful. Mitchell's voice crackled over the communication system. "All ships, this is Crucible Actual. Good work today. The Reapers got a taste of human hospitality, and I don't think they liked it much." Zarathel found herself smiling. Not the polite expression of royal diplomacy, but something fierce and predatory that would have shocked anyone who knew her. She was beginning to understand why her father thought humans were dangerous. She was also beginning to understand why she found that danger so attractive. He galaxy needed against the Void Reapers, and she was beginning to suspect it was exactly what she needed as well. The Void Reaper invasion fleet arrived 72 hours later, dropping out of hyperspace like a plague of darkness against the stars. Zarathel stood in the command center of the human dreadnought Indomitable, wearing modified combat armor that had become as familiar as her royal robes. 3 days of intensive training with human Marines had taught her more about warfare than decades of diplomatic education. 200 vessels, Admiral Chen reported, her voice carrying the calm professionalism that humans seem to maintain even when facing overwhelming odds. Including 6 Harbinger-class world killers. Standard Reaper doctrine suggests they'll attempt to break our orbital defenses before beginning planetary bombardment. Emperor Kethmore's image appeared on the main holographic display, transmitted from the palace bunkers deep beneath Zarion Prime's surface. His 6 eyes were wide with fear as he stared at the tactical readout showing the enemy fleet. "The combined Zarion human force numbers only 80 ships," he said, his voice carrying the despair that had infected his people whenever they faced the Reapers. "We cannot win this battle. Perhaps we should attempt to negotiate terms of surrender." Captain Mitchell, now serving as military liaison to the Zarion royal family, stepped forward. His expression was grim but determined, showing none of the resignation that seemed to plague other galactic species when confronted by impossible odds. "Your Majesty," he said respectfully but firmly, "humans don't negotiate with genocidal monsters. We kill them, all of them. And we make sure they understand that attacking Earth or her allies is the last mistake they'll ever make." Zarathel felt a thrill run through her at his words. 3 days of training alongside human warriors had awakened something in her that she hadn't known existed, a hunger for battle that her species had suppressed for millennia in pursuit of civilized behavior. "Father," she said, her voice carrying new authority, "the humans are right. The Reapers cannot be reasoned with. They must be destroyed." Emperor Kethmore's image flickered as he studied his daughter with obvious concern. The princess, who had left for diplomatic meetings 3 days ago, had returned as something else entirely, still recognizably his child, but harder, more confident, carrying herself like a warrior rather than a diplomat. "Daughter, you speak as if we actually have a chance of victory." "We do," Zarathel replied, her 4 hands moving to weapon controls that had been installed at her station. "But only if we fight like humans instead of like Zerions." Admiral Chen's voice cut through the family discussion. "All ships, this is Fleet Command. The enemy is beginning their approach. Human vessels will execute Doctrine 7. Zerion ships are requested to provide support as able." Through the command center's massive viewport, Zarathel watched the human fleet begin its deployment. Unlike every military formation she had studied, the humans seemed to be scattering randomly, their ships breaking into small groups that accelerated toward the Void Reaper fleet at maximum speed. "Admiral," the Zerion fleet commander's voice crackled over the communication system, "your ships are abandoning formation. How can we provide coordinated support if you refuse to maintain battle lines?" Admiral Chen's response was delivered with the casual confidence that Zarathel had learned to associate with human military planning. "Commander, human naval doctrine is simple. Get close, hit hard, and keep shooting until everything stops moving. Your ships are welcome to follow our lead or hang back and provide covering fire. Either way, we're going to ram ourselves down the Reapers' throats until they choke on us." The first contact between human ships and the Void Reaper fleet was spectacular in its violence. Instead of the careful, long-range engagement that civilized species preferred, the humans charged directly into the enemy formation, their weapons firing continuously as they closed to point-blank range. Indomitable, "This is Fury," a pilot's voice reported over the tactical channel. "I'm making a run on Harbinger 7. If this doesn't work, tell my kids their daddy said goodbye." Zarathel watched the small human destroyer accelerate toward a Void Reaper world killer that dwarfed it like a predator facing prey. At the last moment, the destroyer's pilot ejected his ship's fusion reactor, turning his vessel into a guided nuclear bomb that punched through the Harbinger's hull before detonating. The explosion was visible from across the solar system, a brief new star that marked the death of both the human destroyer and the Reaper world killer. But instead of mourning their fallen comrade, the other human pilots became more aggressive, their attacks intensifying with what could only be described as righteous fury. "They're actually enjoying this," Zarathel realized with amazement, listening to human voices over the communication channels. Despite facing overwhelming odds, despite losing ships and crews, the human pilot sounded excited rather than afraid. "Pain makes us stronger," Mitchell explained, standing beside her at the tactical station. "Every ship we lose makes the survivors fight harder. The Reapers expect their enemies to become demoralized by casualties. Humans become inspired by them." On the tactical display, Zarathel could see the battle developing in ways that defied every strategic principle she had been taught. Human ships were breaking formation to shield damaged allies. Pilots were ejecting at the last moment only to be picked up by other vessels. And coordinated strikes were being planned and executed through what appeared to be pure intuition rather than careful calculation. "Your tactics make no logical sense," she said, though she was clearly fascinated rather than critical. "Logic is overrated," Mitchell replied with his characteristic grin. "Sometimes the best plan is to do something so crazy that the enemy can't predict it." As if to prove his point, a group of human fighters suddenly accelerated away from the main battle, diving toward Zerion Prime's surface. For a moment, Zarathel thought they were retreating, but then she realized their actual intention. "They're going after the planetary bombardment ships," she said with growing excitement. "They're using the planet's gravity well to slingshot around and attack from below." The maneuver was brilliant in its simplicity and insane in its execution. The human pilots were using their homeworld as a tactical asset, diving so close to the planetary surface that their heat shields glowed cherry red before pulling up at the last possible moment to attack the Reaper bombardment fleet from an unexpected angle. "That maneuver has a 60% casualty rate," Admiral Chen noted calmly, as if discussing weather patterns. "We consider those acceptable odds." Zarathel found herself laughing. Not the polite amusement of royal protocol, but something wild and fierce that would have shocked anyone who had known her before this week. Acceptable odds of 60% casualties? No civilized military force would consider such losses anything but catastrophic. Humans treated them as the price of doing business. "Admiral," she said impulsively, "I request permission to join the surface attack squadron." Both Mitchell and Admiral Chen turned to stare at her. "Your Highness," Mitchell said carefully, "that's not a diplomatic mission. That's a combat operation with minimal survival probability." "Then it's perfect for someone who's learned to fight like a human," Zarathel replied, her four hands already moving to her station's flight controls. "I refuse to watch this battle from safety while others risk their lives defending my homeworld." Admiral Chen studied the princess for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Launch Bay 7 has a modified fighter prepped for your physiology. Try not to get yourself killed. Your Highness, your father would never forgive us." 5 minutes later, Zarathel was screaming through Zerion Prime's atmosphere in a human fighter, her four hands dancing across controls that no longer felt foreign. The surface attack squadron had been reduced to 8 ships from an original 12, but the survivors were pressing their attack with the relentless aggression she had learned to expect from human military operations. "Scarab Squadron, this is Scarab 9, she reported over the tactical channel, using the call sign the human pilots had assigned her. "Ready for attack run." "Copy, Scarab 9, the squadron leader replied. "Remember, we're going after the command ship. One pass, everything we've got, then we get out of here." The Void Reaper bombardment fleet was positioned in high orbit, their massive vessels already beginning to charge weapons that could crack planetary crusts like eggshells. Zarathel felt the familiar terror that all civilized beings experienced when facing the Reapers, but underneath it burned something new, a savage anticipation that she had learned from her human teachers. The attack run was a blur of acceleration, targeting computers and weapons fire. Zarathel found herself flying in formation with human pilots who treated atmospheric combat like an extreme sport, diving through energy fields that could have incinerated their ships while laughing over the communication channels. "Scarab 9, you've got a Reaper fighter on your tail," someone reported calmly. Zarathel checked her rear displays, seeing the angular shadow of a Void Reaper pursuit craft closing on her position. 3 days ago, she would have panicked, attempted evasive maneuvers, called for help. Instead, she did something that would have horrified every military academy in the galaxy. She slammed her fighter into a sharp turn that brought her nose to nose with her pursuer, accelerated to maximum speed, and opened fire with every weapon her ship carried. The Reaper pilot, expecting his prey to flee, had no time to react before Zarathel's fighter tore through his vessel's hull. The explosion buffeted her ship, but she was already pulling up for another attack run on the bombardment fleet. "Nice kill, Scarab 9, the squadron leader reported with obvious approval. "You're learning to think like a human." The bombardment command ship was a massive vessel bristling with weapons and defensive systems. Any rational military force would have attempted to disable it through careful, coordinated strikes designed to minimize casualties. The human squadron dove directly at its bridge, firing everything they carried while accelerating to ramming speed. Zarathel found herself screaming, not from fear, but from pure battle joy as her fighters' weapons tore into the enemy vessel's hull. Depleted uranium rounds, nuclear missiles, and particle beams carved through Reaper armor while her squad mates pressed their attacks with suicidal determination. The command ship's destruction was spectacular, a chain reaction that spread through the bombardment fleet as secondary explosions triggered neighboring vessels. When the fireworks finally faded, 6 Reaper capital ships had been reduced to expanding clouds of debris. Scarab Squadron. "This is Fleet Command," Admiral Chen's voice crackled over the communication system. "Outstanding work. Return to base for rearming and refueling." As Zarathel guided her fighter back toward the fleet, she could see the larger battle reaching its climax. The Void Reaper force had been reduced to scattered remnants, their formation shattered by human tactics that treated overwhelming odds as interesting challenges rather than insurmountable obstacles. "Fleet Command, this is Scarab 9, she reported as she approached the landing bay, requesting permission to rejoin the battle. "Negative, Your Highness," Admiral Chen replied. "You've done enough for one day. Besides, I think Captain Mitchell would like a word with you." Mitchell was waiting in the landing bay when her fighter touched down, his expression unreadable as she climbed out of the cockpit. For a moment, Zarathel wondered if she had overstepped some boundary, violated some protocol by joining the attack without proper authorization. Then he smiled, that fierce, proud expression she had come to associate with humans, acknowledging exceptional performance. "Your Highness," he said formally, "on behalf of the Terran Defense Force, I would like to offer you a commission as an honorary captain in the Human Marines." Zarathel felt her hearts racing as she realized what he was actually offering. Not just recognition of her combat performance, but acceptance into the warrior culture that had fascinated her since their first meeting. "I accept," she said immediately, then added more quietly, "but I have one condition." Mitchell raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "When this is over," she said, stepping closer to him, "I want you to teach me more about human customs, particularly the ones involving courtship between warriors." Mitchell's grin widened into something that could have powered a small star. "Your Highness, I think that can be arranged." Behind them, the last Void Reaper vessel exploded in the darkness of space, marking the end of an invasion fleet that had terrorized the galaxy for millennia. The combined Zerion human force had achieved what military experts had declared impossible, total victory against overwhelming odds. But Zarathel was no longer watching the battle. She was studying Mitchell's face, noting the scars that marked a lifetime of combat, the confidence that came from facing impossible odds and emerging victorious, the fierce joy that humans brought to everything they did. Her father's empire had been saved by an alliance with a species that most of the galaxy considered barbarians. Zarathel was beginning to suspect that barbarians were exactly what civilization needed. And she was absolutely certain that this particular barbarian was exactly what she needed. The war against the Void Reapers was far from over, but for the first time in galactic history, the monsters had encountered an enemy that fought harder when afraid, grew stronger when hurt, and treated impossible odds as personal challenges. Humanity had arrived on the galactic stage, and the universe would never be the same. Neither would Princess Zarathel, who had discovered that sometimes the best diplomatic relations involved depleted uranium rounds and nuclear missiles. She had fallen for a human warrior and in doing so had learned to fight like one,